Bewitched cast a spell on television, but behind the magic was heartbreak. While Samantha charmed the world, the real lives of the cast were marked by illness, addiction, and fading fame. Today, we remember the people behind the enchantment and the pain they couldn't vanish. Elizabeth Montgomery as Samantha Stevens. Elizabeth Montgomery, born April 15, 1933, became a television legend when she stepped into the role of Samantha Stevens on Bewitched in 1964. She was just 31 years old, radiant, poised, and effortlessly magical. The perfect suburban witch with a twitch of her nose and a heart of gold. But the real woman behind the charm was anything but conventional. Her life was a storm of broken marriages, emotional battles, and a constant fight to be seen as something more than America's sweetheart. Elizabeth was born into Hollywood royalty, the daughter of actor Robert Montgomery, a man as revered as he was controlling. From a young age, she was pushed toward the spotlight, but forced to walk a narrow line, always graceful, always proper, always smiling. That early pressure shaped her and wounded her. While she loved performing, she often longed to break free from the image her father and the industry imposed on her. When she took the role of Samantha, a witch trying to live a normal life, she connected to it far more deeply than fans realized. Samantha wasn't just fun and fantasy. She was Elizabeth's rebellion, a symbol of a woman with power forced to hide it to keep others comfortable. Behind the scenes of Bewitched, Elizabeth's life was far more complicated than the perfect housewife she portrayed. She married 4 times, most famously to producer William Asher, who directed and co-created Bewitched. Their marriage initially seemed like a dream match, but the truth was darker. Asher controlled much of her career, and as their marriage began to crumble, so did her joy in the show. By the final seasons, Elizabeth grew distant, and the sparkle in Samantha's eyes began to fade. They divorced in 1973. Elizabeth also had a secret affair with Richard Michaels, the show's director, during the final season, a relationship that contributed to the show's abrupt end in 1972. The fallout was painful. She walked away not just from the series, but from the image of Samantha altogether. After Bewitched, Elizabeth tried to reinvent herself. She took on serious, often gritty roles, including a rape survivor in A Case of Rape and Lizzie Borden in The Legend of Lizzie Borden. These performances earned her critical acclaim, but they also revealed something raw and unresolved in her. She was searching for her voice, and for the first time stepping into characters that mirrored her internal battles, but her personal life remained unsettled. Her 4th and final marriage to actor Robert Foxworth brought some peace, but her relationship with her children was sometimes strained. She struggled with feelings of guilt, distance, and the cost of always being on. Friends described her as a woman of deep warmth and deep sadness. She hated interviews, avoided fan events, and often deflected praise with sarcasm. It was as if she never truly believed she had earned the love she received. In the early 1990s, Elizabeth was diagnosed with colon cancer. She kept it private, telling only her closest family and refusing to let the public see her suffering. The disease spread quickly to her liver, but she refused aggressive treatment, choosing instead to spend her final months at home in Beverly Hills with Foxworth and her children nearby. On May 18, 1995, Elizabeth Montgomery died in her sleep at the age of 62. No funeral was held per her wishes. She was cremated, and her ashes scattered a quiet end to a woman whose life had always been lived in the public eye, even when her soul remained hidden. Dick York as Darren Stevens. Dick York, born September 4, 1928 in Fort Wayne, Indiana, stepped into the role of Darren Stevens, the often frustrated but lovable husband of Samantha when Bewitched debuted in 1964. He was 36 years old, charming, boyish, and full of nervous energy, the perfect mortal foil to a magical wife. On screen, he was hilarious and endearing, but off-screen his life was slowly crumbling, wrecked by a painful injury, an opioid addiction that followed, and a Hollywood that discarded him when he needed help the most. York began acting in radio as a child during the Great Depression, helping support his family with his voice before ever stepping in front of a camera. By his 20s, he was working alongside Hollywood greats like Gary Cooper in They Came to Cordura 1959. It was during the filming of that movie that his life changed forever. While filming a scene involving a railroad handcar, York was severely injured, tearing the muscles along the right side of his back and neck. The pain was immediate and excruciating, but also invisible. And so, like many actors of his time, he pressed on, ignoring the agony while quietly becoming dependent on painkillers just to function. By the time Bewitched began, York was already battling chronic pain, masking it with medication and willpower. He often filmed episodes propped up on one side using cleverly placed furniture or camera angles to hide his struggle. The cast and crew adored him, but they could see him fading. Elizabeth Montgomery and Agnes Moorehead in particular tried to protect him on set, but the pain never left. Never. In 1969, after 5 seasons, York collapsed on set. The pain had become unmanageable. He was forced to leave the show and was quietly replaced by Dick Sargent. There was no farewell episode, no explanation, just a disappearance as if Darren himself had been wished away. And just like that, Dick York's career was over. Hollywood stopped calling. He was typecast, broken, and addicted. For years, he lived in poverty, racked by physical agony and the humiliation of being forgotten. He and his wife, Joey York, moved into a small house in Michigan where she cared for him while he struggled to regain his life. He never stopped trying. In the 1980s, after decades of silence, Dick York re-emerged not as an actor, but as an activist. He founded Acting for Life, a non-profit organization aimed at helping the homeless and those in need. Even as he lived with emphysema and breathing through an oxygen tank, he made calls to donors, wrote letters, and gave interviews from his hospital bed. On February 20th, 1992, Dick York died at the age of 63 in Grand Rapids, Michigan, from complications of emphysema. He had smoked for most of his life, a habit he admitted helped him cope with stress and pain. His final words spoken to his beloved wife Joey were simply, "I love you." Dick Sargent as Darren Stevens. Dick Sargent, born Richard Stanford Cox on April 19, 1930 in Carmel, California, became the new face of Darren Stevens on Bewitched in 1969 after Dick York's health forced him to leave the show. At 39 years old, Sargent stepped into an impossible role, replacing a beloved actor in a beloved show, all while hiding a truth he couldn't speak aloud. On screen, he was polished and professional. His version of Darren was more reserved, slightly more cynical, but still deeply in love with Samantha. He carried the role with dignity, despite constant comparisons and backlash from fans who preferred York. But behind the smile and the suits was a man quietly carrying a lifelong secret, one that in the era of 1960s Hollywood could destroy a career. He was gay. Sargent came from a well-off background. His mother was a successful film and television producer, and his early years were filled with promise. He studied drama at Stanford University and soon found work in television and film. He appeared in dozens of shows before Bewitched, including The Tammy Grimes Show, Gunsmoke, and Leave It to Beaver. But despite the growing resume, he was never fully at ease, always watching what he said, how he moved, who he was seen with. When he joined Bewitched, the pressure intensified. The show's wholesome image and massive popularity meant that any hint of scandal could have cost him everything. So he smiled, acted, and stayed quiet, even as the role that brought him the most fame also trapped him in silence. After Bewitched ended in 1972, Sargent's career slowly declined. He appeared in smaller roles, TV, movies, and commercials, but he was never again a household name. In interviews, he seemed upbeat, but friends later revealed he struggled with depression, loneliness, and anger at the double life he had been forced to live. Everything changed in 1991 when Sargent, now in his 60s, publicly came out as gay, becoming one of the first major television stars to do so. He did it on National Coming Out Day, not for attention, but to stand in solidarity with LGBTQ+ youth struggling with their identity. He later said, "I would rather lose a job than lose myself." It was an act of deep courage and quiet liberation. In that same year, tragedy struck. His longtime partner died of a brain tumor, and soon after Sargent was diagnosed with prostate cancer. Though weakened, he devoted his final years to AIDS awareness, LGBTQ+ activism. and speaking openly about acceptance and love, often at a time when the public still didn't want to hear it. On July 8, 1994, Dick Sargent died at the age of 64 at his home in Los Angeles. He died peacefully, surrounded by love, no longer hiding. His ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean. Agnes Moorehead as Endor. Agnes Moorehead, born December 6, 1900, took on the unforgettable role of Endor Samantha's caustic, colorful, and otherworldly mother in Bewitched when the series premiered in 1964. She was 63 years old, regal in her bearing, razor-sharp in delivery, and gloriously unapologetic. On screen, she was enchanting, exasperating, and impossible to ignore, just as she was in real life. Born in Clinton, Massachusetts, to a Presbyterian minister and a classically trained singer, Agnes was raised with strict values and a deep love for literature and language. She earned multiple degrees, including a master's from the University of Wisconsin, and later trained at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts. She spoke 6 languages, and once said she preferred reading theology over attending Hollywood parties. Before Bewitched, Moorehead had already earned a reputation as a powerhouse. She appeared in Orson Welles' Citizen Kane 1941, voiced dozens of iconic radio roles, and was nominated for 4 Academy Awards, including for The Magnificent Ambersons. She was often described as too intelligent for the roles she was offered. When Bewitched came her way, she took the part reluctantly, thinking it was beneath her classical training. But she grew to love the cast, especially Elizabeth Montgomery, whom she treated like a daughter. Still, Agnes never truly shook the feeling that her finest work had been in the past, and the show, however adored by fans, wasn't the legacy she'd imagined for herself. Her personal life was marked by deep emotional complexity. She was married once to actor John Griffith Lee, but the marriage ended in divorce in 1952. She never remarried and had no children. Her strict religious upbringing, combined with her intense privacy, fueled decades of speculation about her sexuality, rumors she never confirmed or denied. Many biographers believe she may have lived as a closeted lesbian, navigating a world that offered little safety for women like her. In the early 1970s, she began experiencing serious health issues. In 1972, she was diagnosed with uterine cancer, a disease she believed was connected to her work on the 1956 film The Conqueror, which was filmed near a nuclear test site in Utah. Many cast and crew members from that film, including John Wayne, would later also develop cancer, leading to years of suspicion that the location had been contaminated. As her health declined, Moorehead refused to slow down. She continued to act on stage, often performing while in pain. She remained gracious with fans, but insisted on maintaining her dignity and mystery. In her will, she left money to over 20 charities, including religious organizations, educational institutions, and art programs. On April 30, 1974, Agnes Moorehead died at the age of 73 at Methodist Hospital in Rochester, Minnesota. Her final days were private, surrounded by close friends and her faith. She was buried in Dayton, Ohio, next to her mother and father, far from the lights of Hollywood. David White as Larry Tate. David White, born April 4, 1916, became a familiar face to millions when he stepped into the role of Larry Tate, the smooth-talking, flip-flopping advertising executive on Bewitched. He was 48 years old when the show began, bringing energy and wit to a character who could shift morals as fast as his clients changed minds. But off-screen, White was nothing like the loud, laugh-driven man he portrayed. He was quiet, disciplined, and carrying grief he rarely spoke about. Before Bewitched, David had built a solid career as a stage and screen actor. He served in the U.S. Marine Corps during World War II, and later landed roles in respected films like The Apartment and Sweet Smell of Success. But his life was struck by heartbreak in 1958, years before the fame of Bewitched would come. David had married Mary Welch, a rising Broadway actress, and the two had a son, Jonathan. But tragedy came suddenly. Mary died from medical complications at just 36 years old. The loss devastated David. He never remarried, choosing instead to raise his son alone and live largely outside the Hollywood limelight. On the set of Bewitched, he was known as professional, punctual, and polite. While others mingled with the press, David avoided the spotlight. To most, he was simply Larry Tate. But beneath the performance was a man who had already buried the love of his life and who feared losing more. Then, in 1988, the unimaginable happened. His only son, Jonathan White, was killed in the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing over Lockerbie, Scotland, one of the deadliest terrorist attacks of the decade. Jonathan was just 33. Those close to David say he was never the same again. He stopped appearing publicly and withdrew into complete privacy. David White died of a heart attack on November 27, 1990, at the age of 74. He passed away quietly without fanfare. His ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean, a gentle, silent farewell, fitting for a man who spent his life avoiding the noise of fame. George Tobias as Abner Kravitz. George Tobias, born July 14, 1901 in New York City, became a beloved figure to television audiences as the perpetually annoyed television-watching neighbor Abner Kravitz in Bewitched. When the series began in 1964, he was 63 years old, a seasoned character actor with decades of film and stage experience. With his dry wit and perfect comic timing, Tobias gave Abner a heart beneath the grumbling, the everyman trapped in suburban absurdity. But off-screen, his life was marked by solitude, quiet grief, and a longing that never quite found peace. Raised in a working-class Jewish family, Tobias began acting as a teenager in Yiddish theater before moving into Broadway and eventually Hollywood. By the 1940s, he was a familiar face in Warner Brothers films, often cast as the comical sidekick or affable friend in movies like Yankee Doodle Dandy and Sergeant York. Though never a leading man, he was always reliable, always memorable, a respected presence in the golden age of Hollywood. But despite his success, Tobias's personal life was eerily quiet. He never married and had no known long-term partners or children. In a town obsessed with romance and image, he kept to himself. Some whispered about his sexuality. Others assumed he had loved and lost. But he never spoke publicly about matters of the heart. His life outside of acting was mostly spent in his modest Hollywood Hills home with classical music books and his cat. When he joined Bewitched, the role of Abner Kravitz gave him a late-career revival. Viewers adored his exasperated chemistry with the nosy, overdramatic Glattis, played first by Alice Pierce and later by Sandra Gould. But George was deeply affected by Pierce's real-life death from cancer in 1966, a loss that reminded him of his own fragility and deepened his withdrawal from public life after the show ended. By the 1970s, Tobias had retired from acting completely. His eyesight began failing and he developed serious health issues. Friends noted that he declined invitations, rarely left home, and became a ghost of a man who had once lit up every room. But he remained proud of his work and humble to the end. On February 27, 1980, George Tobias died of bladder cancer at the age of 78 alone in Los Angeles. He had no family at his bedside, only a few close friends and caretakers. He was buried in the Mount Carmel Cemetery in Glendale, far from the cameras and stage lights he had once known so well. Casey Rogers as Louise Tate. Casey Rogers, born Josie Imogene Rogers on December 15, 1925 in Morehouse, Missouri, joined Bewitched in 1966, replacing Irene Vernon as Louise Tate, the elegant and supportive wife of Larry Tate. She was 40 years old when she took the role, poised, polished, and refined, offering a grounded contrast to the show's supernatural chaos. Casey began her career in the 1940s under the name Laura Elliott, landing ingenue roles in suspense films like Strangers on a Train. Her face was radiant, her smile cinematic, and yet she was never fully embraced as a leading lady. By the mid-1950s, she disappeared from the screen, choosing instead to focus on raising her children. But like many women in Hollywood, the career break came at a cost when she tried to return. The doors had nearly all closed. To find a second act, she changed her name. Casey Rogers was born, and she slowly clawed her way back mostly through guest roles on television. When Bewitched came calling in 1966, it wasn't just another job, it was a resurrection. As Louise Tate, Casey finally found a steady home. Her chemistry with David White Larry brought authenticity to their marriage on screen, and her warmth made her a beloved part of the Bewitched family. But off-screen, she often battled insecurity privately, wondering if she was only seen as a replacement, not just for the role, but in the eyes of an industry that always wanted someone newer, younger, different. In her personal life, Casey endured emotional wounds rarely spoken of in interviews. She married twice. Her second marriage to Walter Winslow was long-lasting, but not without struggles. She lost a child early in her life, a grief she carried quietly for decades. Friends say she was warm, funny, and fiercely loyal, but also someone who never fully believed she was enough, a shadow left by years of near misses in her early Hollywood career. After Bewitched ended, Casey transitioned into writing and motorsports, an unusual but passionate shift. She co-authored several books on motocross, a sport her son was involved in, and became an advocate for women in sports journalism. It was yet another reinvention, and one of the few places where she felt completely herself. In the early 2000s, Casey was diagnosed with throat cancer and later suffered complications from a stroke. Despite her condition, she remained gracious with fans, still attending Bewitched reunions and fan events until her health declined. On July 6, 2006, Casey Rogers died at the age of 80 in Los Angeles. She passed away peacefully, surrounded by family, far from the spotlight, but not forgotten. Sandra Gould as Glattis Kravitz. Sandra Gould, born July 23, 1916, in Brooklyn, New York, stepped into the role of Glattis Kravitz on Bewitched in 1966 at the age of 50. Taking over the part after the untimely death of Alice Pierce, Sandra faced the daunting task of replacing a beloved character and making it her own. And she did, with piercing shrieks, bulging eyes, and a comedic flair that made her version of Glattis iconic. Sandra began her career in radio and vaudeville during the 1930s with a natural knack for timing and dialects. She appeared in over 200 radio shows and later transitioned into films and television, often cast as the fast-talking secretary, or the nosy neighbor roles Hollywood repeatedly handed to women with strong personalities and comedic instinct, and just as quickly forgot. Though Sandra worked steadily for decades, she never broke through to stardom. She was always that face, that voice, never quite a household name. When she landed Bewitched, it was both a blessing and a burden. The audience adored her shrill version of Glattis Kravitz, but Sandra knew she was playing a character who was often laughed at, not with. Privately, she longed for roles with more depth, more dignity. But she also embraced what Bewitched gave her a permanent place in pop culture. Still, friends say she would sometimes wonder if she was respected as an actress or remembered as a gimmick. Her personal life carried deep wounds. Sandra was married twice, and her second husband, television executive Larry Burns, passed away suddenly in the 1960s. She never remarried. The loss left a lasting scar, one she covered with humor, public appearances, and a busy schedule. She had one son whom she adored, but her life often felt empty once the cameras stopped rolling. In her later years, she authored books on etiquette and even tried her hand at writing comedic columns. But as age and illness crept in the industry, as it so often does, stopped calling. She made one final appearance in the Brady Bunch movie in 1995, a small nostalgic cameo that reminded audiences of the quirky voice they hadn't heard in years. On July 20th, 1999, just 3 days before her 83rd birthday, Sandra Gould passed away from a stroke in Burbank, California. Her death barely made headlines. There was no grand memorial, no tribute show. But for those who grew up watching Bewitched, her screams, gasps, and frantic curtain peeking had long become unforgettable. Alice Pierce as Glattis Kravitz. Alice Pierce, born October 16, 1917 in New York City, became instantly unforgettable to television audiences as the original Glattis Kravitz on Bewitched, the nosy neighbor whose constant shrieks at magical mayhem were met with disbelief from her husband and indifference from the world around her. She was 46 years old when the show began in 1964, and already living under a shadow she never revealed publicly she was dying. From the outside, Alice was all energy, wit, and perfect comic timing. With her wide-eyed expressions and neurotic delivery, she turned a potentially silly role into a comedic masterclass, winning an Emmy Award posthumously for her performance. But what fans never saw was that Alice Pierce was battling terminal cancer during every episode she filmed, smiling and working even as her body was slowly betraying her. Alice's life had been shaped by struggle from the beginning. As a child, she suffered a devastating fall that left her with a disfigured chin, something she carried for the rest of her life and which Hollywood never let her forget. She was never cast as the romantic lead. Instead, she was typecast as the quirky best friend, the oddball, the scene stealer with a funny face. But instead of resenting it, she leaned into it, becoming one of Broadway's and television's most reliable comic actresses. She broke out with a scene-stealing role in the original Broadway production of On the Town in 1944, and later reprised her part in the film version. Audiences adored her. But despite her success, she longed for more than comic relief. She wanted depth, dramatic roles, and respect. Hollywood, however, rarely allowed women who didn't fit a narrow mold to reach those heights. In her personal life, Alice found joy and stability in her marriage to composer Paul Davis, whom she wed in 1948. He was her rock, her quiet protector, and the only one who knew the full weight of what she carried during her years on Bewitched. In 1964, shortly before filming began, Alice was diagnosed with ovarian cancer, but she refused to let it stop her. She told no one on the cast or crew, not even Elizabeth Montgomery or Dick York, and continued to show up to work hiding her pain behind rehearsals and laughter. As her health deteriorated, it became harder to conceal. She lost weight rapidly. Her voice thinned. Her movement slowed, yet her commitment never wavered. She filmed until she physically could not stand any longer. On March 3, 1966, Alice Pierce died at the age of 48, just months after wrapping her final scenes. The news stunned the cast and broke the hearts of fans who had no idea she had been sick at all. She was buried in Forest Lawn Memorial Park, the same resting place as many of Hollywood's legends, though few had given as much with so little time. Marian Lorn as Aunt Clara. Marian Lorn, born August 12, 1883 in West Pittston, Pennsylvania, became a household name late in life as the bumbling, button-collecting Aunt Clara on Bewitched. She was 81 years old when the show began, a rare age to enter the spotlight, and yet she stole every scene with her trembling voice, innocent magic mishaps, and timeless warmth. Marian was born into a conservative family in the late 19th century. She studied at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts and began her career in theater, spending decades performing on Broadway and the London stage. She was a classically trained, deeply respected stage actress, but when Hollywood arrived in the 1920s and 30s, Marian was seen as too old-fashioned, too quirky, and not glamorous enough for leading roles. She married playwright Walter C. Hackett, and together they ran a London theater for years. Theirs was a strong partnership rooted in mutual respect and creative collaboration. But after Walter's death in 1944, Marian never remarried. She returned to the U.S. alone and began taking small roles in film and television, often as forgetful aunts or flustered landladies. For years, she was a supporting player, never a star, known for her nervous mannerisms and fluttery hands traits that weren't invented for Aunt Clara. They were authentically Marian. And when Bewitched came along, it was as if the role had been written for her soul. Aunt Clara was silly, yes, but she was also pure-hearted, a loving misfit among gods and witches, and that's exactly how Marian had felt in real life. She poured herself into the part, often bringing her own antique doorknob collection to the set to use as props. Her co-stars adored her, especially Elizabeth Montgomery, who called her the kindest soul to ever step on a soundstage. Despite failing health and advancing age, Marian never missed a shoot. She showed up on time, knew her lines, and gave everything she had to each take. When asked why she worked so hard in her 80s, she once replied softly, "Because I've waited my whole life to be seen." Tragically, she didn't live to see how much she was loved. On May 9, 1968, Marian Lorn died of a heart attack in New York City at the age of 84, just weeks before she was to receive an Emmy Award for Outstanding Supporting Actress in a Comedy Series. The award was given posthumously and accepted in tears by Elizabeth Montgomery and William Asher. Bernard Fox as Dr. Bombay. Bernard Fox, born Bernard Lawson on May 11, 1927 in Port Talbot, Wales, became a fan favorite as the flamboyant and eccentric Dr. Bombay, the magical physician to witches and warlocks on Bewitched. He was 40 years old when he first appeared in 1967, sporting outrageous outfits, booming entrances, and a voice that could command an entire coven or at least make Samantha roll her eyes. But behind the booming laugh and scene-stealing flair was a man whose real life was shaped not by magic, but by war displacement and the quiet fear of irrelevance in a world that quickly forgets the character actors who once made it smile. Bernard came from a showbiz family and made his stage debut at just 18 months old. His early life was interrupted by World War II, where he served in the Royal Navy. It was during these years of hardship and trauma that he developed the dry wit and timing that would become his trademark. After the war, he returned to acting and began building a resume across British and American television, often playing military men, comic aristocrats, or clueless colonels, thanks to his impeccable accent and bearing. Roles in Hogan's Heroes, The Mummy 1999 and Titanic 1997, where he played Colonel Archibald Gracie, kept him in the public eye for decades. As Dr. Bombay, Fox was given a rare opportunity to be wild, silly, unpredictable, and beloved. He appeared in only 19 episodes, but his presence was so strong, so joyful, that many fans believed he was part of the core cast. The role, though brief, became the defining part of his career. Yet off-screen, Bernard lived a modest, quiet life. He married Jacqueline Fox, his wife of more than 50 years, and had 2 children. He avoided scandal, rarely gave interviews, and spent much of his time away from Hollywood's parties and premieres. He was never comfortable with fame, and often said he felt grateful, but puzzled that audiences loved Dr. Bombay so much. In his later years, Bernard watched as younger actors took the spotlight and parts became fewer. He never complained. He'd lived through bombs and rationing. The rejection of casting directors didn't scare him. But friends said he sometimes wondered if anyone remembered the other roles, the other performances, or just the one with the mustache and safari hat. Health issues began to plague him in the 2010s, and he quietly retired from acting. On December 14, 2016, Bernard Fox died of heart failure in Van Nuys, California, at the age of 89. He passed away surrounded by family and peace, far from the chaos of television studios, but forever remembered by millions of fans who still hear calling Dr. Bombay and smile. The cast of Bewitched gave everything they had on screen and off. And though their time has passed, their legacy still shimmers like fairy dust across generations. If their stories moved you, honor their memory by liking, sharing, and subscribing, so the magic never fades and the people behind it are never forgotten.